A young orphan named Emma was dragged onto an auction block in Dry Creek, treated like property in front of the whole town. At the center of it stood Crawford, the man who owned half the land and it seemed half the law, smiling as he sold her future to the highest bidder. But Jacob Hartman, a former cavalry captain with his own scars from the past, stepped forward with a move that no one in the square saw coming. And just wait until you hear how this standoff ended and why, in the end, justice rode out of that town with them. Jacob Hartman rode his bay gelding down the long stretch of sun-bleached trail toward Dry Creek, the horse's steady gait sending a rhythmic jolt up through the worn leather of his saddle. The air was thick with the dry weight of late summer, each breath tasting of dust and sagebrush. Heat rippled up from the hard-packed earth, turning the horizon into a wavering sheet of brass. A thin line of sweat ran down between his shoulder blades, soaking into the back of his faded shirt. The gelding's ears flicked at the faint buzz of cicadas and the occasional cry of a hawk circling somewhere overhead. Jacob kept his hat low, shadowing his eyes from the glare, his thoughts fixed on the simple errand ahead. Pick up a box of cartridges, maybe a few supplies, and head back to his stretch of land by the river. Out there, the world was quieter. The cottonwoods gave shade, and the slow, steady current never asked questions. As he approached the edge of town, the usual hum of small voices and wagon wheels began to change. Dry Creek had a rhythm he knew well. The ring of a hammer from the blacksmith's shop, the door hinges of the general store creaking open and shut, an occasional laugh drifting from the saloon. But now there was something else, an undercurrent of expectation in the air, the low, collective murmur of people gathered for a single purpose. Rounding the last bend before the square, Jacob saw the crowd. Men in wide-brimmed hats, their boots planted firm in the dust, arms crossed tight over chests that had seen years of work and weather. Women in sun-faded dresses stood together in clusters, whispering in tones too low to catch, their faces shaded by bonnets, but their eyes fixed on the same point. At the center of it all, a rough platform had been thrown together from warped planks. Above it, nailed to the limb of an old tree, hung a weathered board. The paint had long since peeled in places, but the black letters still shouted their meaning clearly: auction. Jacob's first instinct was to ride straight past. He had no use for the kind of business that turned hardship into a spectacle. Auctions in Dry Creek weren't always about cattle or equipment. Sometimes they were about debts, and sometimes debts were paid in ways a decent man didn't care to think on. He shifted in the saddle, tightening his knees, ready to steer the gelding around the gathering and get back to his day. But then, from the corner of his eye, movement caught his attention. Two men emerged from the edge of the crowd, each broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark leather vests. Between them they led a figure small enough to be almost hidden by their size. It was a girl, barefoot, her feet caked in dust, the thin fabric of her dress hanging in tatters at the hem. At her wrists hung the broken halves of iron shackles, the jagged ends still showing where they'd been forced apart. The skin beneath was raw, ringed with marks that told a longer story than any words could. And yet, she did not hang her head. She did not look at the ground the way so many in her place would. Her chin was lifted, her gaze sweeping over the crowd as though she were studying them, measuring each face, daring them to speak. A low, controlled fire began to build in Jacob's chest. He pulled the gelding to a halt without even realizing it, boots settling deep in the stirrups. His jaw tightened. "Who is she?" His voice carried across the space to a man leaning lazily against a hitching post. The man glanced over, barely interested. "Orphan," he said, rolling the word slow, as if it explained everything. "Wanderer. Sheriff says she's no good to the town. Put her up for sale before she gets to be a problem." He shrugged, eyes already drifting back to the platform. Jacob said nothing at first. He'd seen the harsh turns of life on the frontier, the way a storm could strip a man's land bare in a single night, or a bad winter could hollow out a family. But this wasn't wind or frost or the work of the earth. This was deliberate. His grip on the reins grew tighter until the leather creaked under his fingers. Somewhere deep in his chest, that steady fire was turning into something sharper. He knew he could just ride on. Let the town handle its business, keep his own peace. But as he watched the girl standing barefoot on the splintered boards, the thought of passing by felt heavier than the sun on his back. From the shadows at the far side of the platform, a man emerged with the slow, measured stride of someone certain the stage already belonged to him. Mr. Crawford, landowner, lender, and, if the gossip was worth its salt, the true hand that steered the sheriff, was dressed finer than most men in town, in a black coat with pearl buttons and boots polished to a dull shine despite the road dust. His hat brim dipped just enough to shade his eyes, but there was no mistaking the smile on his face, the smile of a man about to profit. He reached the front of the platform and threw his arms wide, letting the crowd's attention soak into him like heat into dry timber. "We'll start the bidding at $20. His voice rolled out across the square, strong and self-assured, each word designed to carry. "A healthy young girl, fit to work, quick to learn." The square answered with a rumble of voices, the kind of sound that was neither cheer nor protest, just the restless stirring of folks deciding how much they cared. Boots shifted in the dust, spurs gave off faint metallic clinks, and the air seemed to press heavier. The first offers came quick, casual, and far too low. 15 from a rancher with a tobacco-stained beard. Another voice from the back suggesting 2 hens and a sack of flour. Each bid drew a ripple of low chuckles and the shake of heads. They were haggling over her as if she were nothing more than a wagon wheel missing a spoke. Jacob stood near the edge of the crowd, half in the sun, half in shadow, his hands resting loosely on the reins. But his eyes didn't leave the girl. She stood with her bare feet planted on the warped boards of the platform, the broken halves of iron shackles still dangling from her wrists. Until now, she'd held herself steady, chin lifted, gaze fixed forward as though she were facing down a dust storm. Then she swallowed hard. It was a small thing, easy to miss. But in that moment, a flicker of fear crossed her face. It was not panic, just the first crack in the wall she'd built to keep herself upright. And that single crack reached Jacob like a spark in dry grass. He knew what lay ahead for her if she went with any of the men calling out their offers. Hard work that didn't end with the sunset. A life where her name didn't matter and her voice counted for less. In Dry Creek, Crawford's nod could seal a fate as surely as the sheriff's badge, and no one here would stand in the way. Jacob's instinct told him to stay out of it, not because he didn't care, but because he knew the cost of stepping in. A man who crossed Crawford in public might as well be moving into trouble's spare room. You didn't win against him by accident. You had to be ready to take the fight the whole way. And then, unbidden, a memory rose. His sister Ruthie, 12 years old, laughing as she braided her hair by the light of a kerosene lamp. He'd been 19 when the debt collectors came for her, a debt their father couldn't pay in coin. Jacob had been away, working a cattle drive, and by the time he returned, she was gone. No word, no trail worth following. The hollow left behind had stayed with him every mile since. Now, standing in the dusty square with the heat pressing on his back, he felt that same hollow stirring. But this time it came with something sharper, an edge that cut through the years. The sound of the crowd dimmed in his ears. He could no longer hear the laughter or the shifting of boots. All he saw was the girl, the sunlight catching on the jagged ends of the shackles, her eyes scanning the faces below like she was still searching for someone who might help. Jacob's fingers tightened around the reins until the leather creaked under his grip. The gelding flicked an ear back at him, sensing the shift in his rider. If he turned away now, she would vanish into the same kind of silence that had swallowed Ruthie. And this time he would have no excuse. Not distance, not ignorance, not the slow grind of years, just choice. Jacob swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots hitting the packed earth with a solid thud. The gelding shifted behind him, tossing its head, but Jacob kept his stride steady as he crossed the space toward the platform. The crowd parted just enough to let him through, eyes tracking him with a mix of curiosity and the quiet hope for a show. When he reached the foot of the stage, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he untied the small leather pouch from his belt, its weight pulling at his palm. Then, without ceremony, he tossed it onto the planks in front of Crawford. The coins inside struck together with a muted metallic chime. 100, he said, not loud but clear enough to cut straight through the noise of the square. The words seemed to draw the air out of the space, and in the sudden stillness, even the wind felt like it had paused to listen. Crawford squinted down at him, the lines around his eyes tightening. 100? Generous for a wanderer? What's to say you can't make it 2? His tone was half challenge, half mockery, meant to test how far Jacob would go. "I can," Jacob answered, his voice firm as weathered oak. "If I have to, but I'm taking her now." He didn't glance away, and for a moment it was just the two of them, the hum of the crowd falling to a low, expectant murmur. That murmur swelled as a few voices tried to outbid him, but the sound carried no conviction. The townsfolk knew Crawford could press the matter if he wanted, and they also knew Jacob's name, ex-cavalry captain, a man whose skill with a rifle was spoken of in the same tone as sudden storms and bad luck, something you didn't invite without reason. Crawford studied him for another heartbeat, then gave a slow nod. "Fine, take her." The words were casual, but the flicker in his eyes said he'd remember this day. The men on either side of the girl stepped forward and unfastened what was left of her restraints. The metal fell away with a small final clink against the wood. She hesitated, glancing toward the edge of the platform as if unsure whether this was truly over. Jacob extended his hand, not rushed, not demanding, just steady. She took a small step forward, then another, until she stood beside him. Up close, she seemed even younger than he'd guessed, the set of her jaw just barely holding against the uncertainty in her eyes. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Emma," she said, her voice almost lost in the murmur of the crowd. Jacob gave her a single nod as if to say the name was already safe with him. They had barely put 2 miles of scrub and dust between themselves and Dry Creek when Jacob caught the change in the air behind them. It wasn't just the faint drum of hooves. It was the way the sound grew, rolling toward them like distant thunder. He glanced back over his shoulder. A thin veil of dust was climbing into the sky, and within it, 4 riders pushed their mounts hard, closing the gap. Jacob's jaw tightened. Of course, Crawford wouldn't let it stand. The man hadn't stayed in power by watching money and pride walk away. He leaned forward in the saddle, voice low but urgent. "Hold tight, Emma." Her small hands clutched at the worn leather of his belt without hesitation. Jacob nudged the gelding into a faster gait, guiding him off the main trail and toward the jagged ridge ahead. The land there folded into a narrow canyon, tight enough to slow a group but still passable if you knew the turns. They reached the canyon mouth just as the riders closed within shouting distance. The path dipped between steep rock faces, the shadows cutting the glare of the late sun. Jacob kept the gelding's pace steady but fast, boots brushing the canyon wall at each bend. Behind them, the echo of hoofbeats grew sharper, bouncing off the stone. A crack split the air, the sharp sound of a rifle. A spray of stone burst from the canyon floor, inches from the gelding's front hoof. The horse snorted, sidestepping, but Jacob kept him steady, his eyes flicking to the trail ahead. Without breaking stride, he reached behind the saddle and drew his Winchester, the weight of the familiar rifle grounding him in the chaos. He didn't turn fully, just swung the barrel over his shoulder and fired in a single fluid motion. The shot rang out, reverberating against the canyon walls. Behind them, one of the pursuers pitched sideways in the saddle, his mount veering off and sending up a fresh cloud of dust. The remaining 3 riders slowed, pulling their horses up before the next narrow bend. Jacob knew they were making a choice. Push on into a canyon where he had the advantage or cut their losses. The answer came quickly. Their hoofbeats faded, replaced by the faint call of a rider shouting to turn back. Jacob kept moving until the canyon began to widen again, the rocky walls giving way to open ground bathed in the deep gold of the setting sun. The air was cooler here, touched with the faint scent of sage and evening grass. Emma loosened her grip and looked up at him. For the first time since he'd seen her on the auction block, her mouth curved into a small, cautious smile, the kind of smile that came from realizing, if only for a moment, that she was truly safe. Jacob glanced down at her, then back to the road ahead. They still had miles to ride before nightfall, but for now the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the quiet promise of open country. Night had settled deep over the plains, the kind of dark that pressed in gently from all sides and made the fire's glow seem warmer than it was. The small flames snapped softly as they licked at the dry mesquite branches Jacob had gathered, sending up thin ribbons of smoke that drifted toward the scattered stars overhead. The gelding grazed a few yards away, its silhouette shifting in the dim light. Emma sat across from Jacob, her knees drawn up, hands wrapped around the tin cup he'd given her. The shadows from the fire played across her face, softening the lines of dust and weariness that the day had carved there. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of grass in the breeze and the low pop of the embers. When she did speak, her voice was quiet but steady. "He found me at the orphanage," she began. "Said there was work, that I'd have my own bed, that I'd earn my keep." She paused, eyes fixed on the flames. "But when we got to Dry Creek, he sold me. Said it was a debt I owed before I'd even started." Jacob didn't move, letting her words find their own space between them. "I ran the first chance I got," she went on. "Found a big flat rock by the old wash. I broke the chains there." She rubbed at her wrists unconsciously, though the shackles were long gone. "Didn't get far. They caught me before the sun went down." The fire cracked. Jacob's gaze stayed on the flames, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. After a moment, she lifted her eyes to him. "Why did you come back?" He looked at her then, the reflection of the firelight flickering in his eyes. For a breath, he said nothing. Then he turned his gaze back to the fire. "Because once before," he said slowly, "I let someone I loved be taken. I told myself I couldn't stop it, and I lived with that every day since." His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that came from years of carrying something too heavy to set down. "I'm not making that mistake again." Emma didn't answer right away. She just nodded once, her lips pressing together as if sealing the words inside. By morning, the fire was nothing more than a circle of pale ash. The sun rose slow and gold, painting the far hills in light. Jacob saddled the gelding, checked the cinch, and helped Emma up behind him. They rode west, toward a stretch of country where, he told her, there was a farm, and folks who wouldn't ask for anything she couldn't give. The trail unfolded before them, the air fresh with the scent of sage after dawn. Emma kept her gaze forward, and for the first time since Jacob had seen her, there was no trace of fear in her eyes, only a quiet, determined set to her jaw. Jacob felt it too. For years he'd been a man riding away from something. Now, for the first time in longer than he could recall, he was riding toward it.